Alright, and in this video we are going to be going over consciousness. And right before I did this, I didn't record it, which is good because when I was revealing more and more about the consciousness, I was able to understand it more and actually break it down to a level where it makes some really good sense. So, consciousness, by the definition, if you go in the dictionary, it will tell you consciousness is the state of being awake and aware of one's surroundings. So there are all sorts of ways to be conscious, okay? Because you could be sleeping and closing your eyes and still be conscious and aware of your surroundings, okay? Now, what I was realizing is what makes consciousness so mysterious is everyone is like, what is consciousness? How does consciousness happen? So, the way it happens is through your brain. So that's basically what consciousness is it's your brain because it's the ability to process, to be aware, to know things, to recognize, to be conscious. Okay, so there's all sorts. You don't even have to be in control of something to still be conscious of something. So, for example, like if the moon is hovering above you, you're just kind of conscious of that, and you may not even necessarily have control over it, but it's still you're conscious of it. So, conscience doesn't necessarily tie into your movements and what you're but it is still being aware of your surroundings because when you move you're aware of what you're conscious of what you've decided that you want to do. So what I was realizing on the best example on how consciousness works is I was realizing on how consciousness and time are one and the same thing, almost like the yin and yang of each other, and that's why they were so confusing for everybody to make sense of. So, because they're two different things. Because being conscious is different than knowing, being able to perceive time. Because you can be conscious, but you can perceive time. That's our ability where it goes to the next level. So here's the example that I came up with in the last video that I was recording, but it didn't record. So for example, let's say a tiger, it has consciousness, right? Artificial intelligence has consciousness. There are just different levels of consciousness because it's just a matter of how much are they aware of their surroundings. So they're very conscious, very aware of their surroundings, but they have limitations because the limitation comes down to, you know, one, what you're aware of your surroundings is different than what you're able to perceive of time. So that's where we're different than a tiger and most of everything else out in it. Where mankind separates itself is that we are able to perceive time. So we know that we are the only ones who are able to perceive time in the most dominant matter. Doesn't mean that everything else isn't still conscious. Everything else has consciousness, and everything else still has a certain level of being able to perceive time. It just so happens that mankind's ability to perceive time is on the highest ratio and highest level over anything that we know of to exist, aside from AI. But that's a little bit different. I'll get into that after this. So, let's say for example, our ability to perceive time on a scale of 1 through 100 is 100 because that we know of we're the main ones that have the ability to understand time, what is going on. That's the ability to understand what is going on, what is going to happen, or what has happened, and what we want to happen. That's the ability to perceive time. So we rule over time. We're at the top of the food chain. We can perceive time better than any other creature or thing that we know of to exist. Okay? So let's say that the tiger's perception of time is a 1. A 1 out of 100 as opposed to our perception of time of being 100 of 100. We have full understanding of what's going to happen, which gives us the advantage and why the tiger is in more danger more often than not over a human as opposed to if the event are to occur, if the human isn't prepared, if they don't know it's going to happen. That's where the tiger has the advantage, right? As soon as, like, if a human or a man or someone doesn't know it's going to happen, they're normally at a disadvantage. So that's normally where a tiger gets the ability to kill a man, or where you hear of a report, oh, a man or a woman, child, whatever, got killed by a tiger because they weren't able to perceive it in time. They didn't know it was going to happen in time. Although, that's where we're the rulers of time, because if the situation where it's more often than not what are to happen, if I were to be in a jungle, and if I were the man on alert, prepared, and I saw a tiger 1,000 yards away, I would know what's going to happen. I would most likely have. I'm not saying I hunt tigers. I'm using this as an example. I'm using it. Let's say someone else was, and they're holding a sniper rifle and they're gonna shoot the tiger because they rule over time. They know what's going to happen. They're conscious of that. They know. Okay, so the tiger doesn't know that. They don't have perception of time. They don't have perception of what is going to happen or what has happened or what could happen. So more often than not, a tiger, if they see somebody with the sniper rifle 1,000 yards away and they're onto them and they're conscious, aware of their surroundings and detect them and notice them, they may not. They're not gonna know that they're in danger because they don't know what's going to happen. They don't know that there's a person holding a sniper rifle. That's their downfall. That's how we rule. That's how man rules over time, is because we know what's going to happen. Well, it took us a long time to figure it all out, but we're at the point where we evolved to that level and attain that level of awareness. So, consciousness is a form of perception of time, kind of. So, consciousness is just the processing. Okay, so it's basically it depends. Nothing. Consciousness doesn't even exist if there isn't even a brain, or if there isn't even something there prior to be aware of it. So it's like time. Time isn't even going to exist if there isn't anything going on to begin with. So it depends on if there's anything even going on. So that's why time always exists, is because there's always something going on. That's why consciousness always exists, is because there's always consciousness. There's always something that exists. If nothing existed, there wouldn't even be consciousness. So how does consciousness happen? What is consciousness? Well, it happens through your brain. If your brain didn't exist in the way that we know of, I mean, period, if it was just not there, 100% not there, as far as that we know of, there would be no consciousness. So basically, consciousness is your brain. It's like you can almost hold your brain in your hand, because that's what your brain is consciousness. Even if you look at a tiger, they have a brain. That's how they're. But I mean, spiders don't necessarily have a brain, but they still have consciousness. But it doesn't necessarily need to be a brain. It's just a matter of the event has to occur. So you're always at the mercy of how the event occurs and if it occurs. So that's how the event occurs for us to be conscious, is through our brain. That's our dimension. That's what we're limited to. A spider is different. They have a different type of brain, and it may still just be a brain. and but anything that has the ability to be aware of their surroundings is conscience. Okay, because it's processing. It knows where it's at. It knows what it's doing. All right, but just because you're aware of your surroundings and conscience doesn't mean that you're unlimited on your perception of time, because your perception of time is limited onto your species. Because same with the spider, a spider doesn't have perception of time, because perception of time exists in the brain. We're the ones who have the highest level of perception of time. There are other creatures that have perception of time, but they just have such a lower level of perception of time. So that's really about all I can cover on consciousness, because it's just the event that is going on. So consciousness is limited to what is actually around you and surrounding you, or what's actually happening. So if there's nothing going on, if you potentially don't exist, then you will not be aware of your surroundings. You will have no consciousness, because that's what it means to not exist. To have not be conscious is to not have a brain. If you're unable to process, to be conscious. So someone who's dead, they're not conscious. They're not aware of their surroundings. They're not able to perceive time, because it's if you're alive, and it's through your brain existing that consciousness even exists, that we know of. That's just from that we know of. I don't know why people don't use that term more often, because it needs to be used nearly every single time anybody talks about anything. That's just what we know of. Okay? What's so hard about using the term? That's just what that we know of. Okay? So everybody wants things to be further ahead than they potentially are, and it's not that we know of, though. It's about focusing on what we know of. This is what we know of, okay? Until we know of something else, it's pure speculation, pure theory, and it doesn't mean it's not a good idea to think about ideas and theories. It's just a matter of understanding the different categories of, well, this is what we know of, and well, this is not what we know of. All right? It's just about knowing the two categories, what we know of and what we don't know of. Okay? Most of the things we don't know of that. We don't know of that. Why can't you people put that in that category? Well, we don't know of that. We don't know of that. Or that's what we know of. What we know of. You have to put it on one side or the other. That's what we know of. That's what we don't know of. Most people, they're always throwing so much stuff out there, but that's not what we know of. We don't know of that. So don't put it out there unless we know of that. That's what we know of.